The gavel slammed against the weathered oak bench, a sound that usually carried the weight of justice, but in this courtroom, it sounded more like a death knell for a man's life. Elias Thorne, a farmer whose hands were as calloused and rugged as the land he tilled, stood motionless. Across the aisle, Sheriff Dale Vance sat with a practiced, smug indifference, his thumbs hooked into his belt. To the casual observer, it was just another property dispute in a sleepy rural county. To those who knew the history of Miller's Creek, it was a slow-motion execution of a man who had simply refused to sell his legacy to the highest bidder. The crowd whispered. Some looked away, unable to stomach the sight of a lifelong neighbor being systematically dismantled by the very law enforcement officer sworn to protect him. Elias wasn't just a farmer, he was a relic of a time when a man's word was his bond and his land was his soul. For 3 generations, the Thorne family had held the acreage bordering the state highway. It was fertile, pristine, and, as Sheriff Vance had made perfectly clear over the last 2 years, suddenly sitting in the middle of a lucrative development opportunity. The prosecution's narrative was as sharp as it was fabricated. They painted Elias as a squatter, a man clinging to property that supposedly lacked the proper deed, a man who had allegedly harassed land surveyors and endangered public safety. Every word was a lie, a carefully constructed tapestry of misinformation designed to turn the community against one of its own. As Elias listened, his knuckles turned white against the edge of the defendant's table. He wanted to scream, to stand up and demand the truth, but he knew the rules of the game. If he spoke out of turn, he would be held in contempt. If he remained silent, he was being written out of his own life. This was the contrast framing of the sheriff's design. The law-abiding official versus the unhinged, obstructionist relic. It was a classic play, executed with surgical precision. Vance had spent 18 months filing nuisance reports, orchestrating minor citations, and fueling rumors in the local diner. He had turned the town's respect for the badge into a weapon, using the social pressure of a small community to isolate Elias until he had no allies left. Even Elias's lawyer, a court-appointed public defender who seemed far more interested in his lunch break than the truth, had advised him to simply walk away. "Just take the settlement, Elias," he had whispered earlier that morning. "You can't fight the badge. Not here. Not ever." But Elias couldn't walk away. It wasn't about the dirt, or the crops, or even the money. It was about the principle of the thing. He knew something that the sheriff didn't, or at least, something the sheriff assumed had been buried deep enough to never see the light of day. Tucked away in a rusted, forgotten lockbox under the floorboards of his barn, wrapped in oilcloth that smelled of cedar and thyme, was a single, yellowed document. It was a paper that hadn't seen the sun in 50 years, a document that detailed the original land surveys of the county, signed by a man whose legacy was unimpeachable. The sheriff leaned over to his deputy, whispering something that made the younger man chuckle. They were already celebrating. They had already divided the spoils. They thought they had backed Elias into a corner from which there was no escape. But as the prosecutor began his closing statement, weaving a web of legal technicalities to strip the Thorne family of their birthright, Elias felt a strange, cold calm settle over him. He watched the clock on the courtroom wall, counting down the seconds. He wasn't just a victim in this scenario, he was a man holding the one piece of evidence that could turn the entire machinery of the sheriff's power against itself. He knew that by the time the sun set on this miserable, humid Tuesday, the landscape of Miller's Creek would be changed forever. The sheriff thought he was the hunter, but he had been walking into a trap the moment he decided to cross a man with nothing left to lose. The courtroom, the judge, and the fabricated evidence were all theater. The real story was about to begin. To understand why Sheriff Vance was so desperate to dismantle Elias Thorne, one has to look at the money, or more specifically, the infrastructure project looming on the horizon. The proposed highway bypass wasn't just a road, it was a multi-million-dollar artery that would cut directly through the valley. It was the kind of project that transformed small-town politicians into wealthy consultants overnight. Vance, a man whose salary was public record but whose lifestyle suggested a much more flexible income, had been quietly buying up surrounding parcels through a shell company. Elias's land, however, stood as a massive, frustrating obstacle. It was the key piece of the puzzle, a geographic bottleneck that forced the highway's path through a more expensive, less profitable route. For months, the pressure had been relentless. It started with routine traffic stops. Every time Elias drove his aging pickup truck into town to pick up supplies, he was pulled over. The routine was always the same: a slow walk around the vehicle, a flashlight beam hitting his eyes, and a barrage of questions about his registration, his tail lights, and his erratic driving. It was a classic tactic of intimidation, the death of 1,000 cuts. The goal was to keep Elias in a state of perpetual anxiety, hoping he would either flee the county or commit an error that would justify an arrest. Then came the zoning notices. Almost every week, a city official would arrive at the farm, accompanied by a sheriff's deputy, to serve a notice for a violation Elias hadn't committed. One day it was illegal water usage, the next, it was a claim that his barn was encroaching on a public easement. Elias, being a man of the land, kept meticulous records. He had a ledger for every gallon of water, every load of feed, and every boundary line survey he had conducted over the decades. He knew he was in compliance, but that didn't matter. The sheriff wasn't looking for violations, he was looking for a paper trail of uncooperative behavior that he could present to a judge. The turning point came when the sheriff attempted to seize the land through eminent domain, citing an obscure public safety clause. He claimed that the Thorne farm was a breeding ground for pests and a fire hazard that threatened the entire region. It was a preposterous assertion, but in a town where the sheriff held the ear of the town council, it was surprisingly effective. The local newspaper, owned by a man who golfed with Vance every Sunday, published a front-page article painting Elias as a stubborn, dangerous recluse. The community, once supportive, began to turn. Neighbors stopped waving. The local feed stores suddenly found themselves out of stock whenever Elias came in. The social isolation was even worse than the legal battle. Elias began to see the true face of the town he had called home for 60 years. He realized that the sheriff's power didn't just come from the badge, it came from the fear that he instilled in others. People didn't necessarily dislike Elias, but they were terrified of being the next target. If the sheriff could bring down a Thorne, what could he do to a small business owner who couldn't afford a lawyer? Despite this, Elias remained resolute. He spent his nights sitting in his dark kitchen, the only light coming from a small kerosene lamp, reviewing his father's old papers. He knew the document he possessed, the 1974 land grant signed by the former county commissioner, was the smoking gun. It didn't just prove ownership, it explicitly stated that the land was designated as a historical legacy site, exempting it from any and all commercial development or eminent domain proceedings. The sheriff had been banking on the fact that the original county commissioner had died in a private plane crash in 1975, and that the only copy of the land grant had vanished with him. Vance believed he had wiped the slate clean. He believed he was rewriting history. He had no idea that the stubborn old farmer had been holding onto the original, signed, and notarized copy for half a century, waiting for the exact moment when the sheriff's arrogance would blind him to the truth. The courtroom was just the stage, and the trap was perfectly set. The third day of the proceedings was supposed to be the final blow. Sheriff Vance had coordinated with the district attorney to bring in a land surveyor expert from the state capitol. This man, a sleek individual in a tailored suit who looked like he had never seen a patch of dirt in his life, presented a digital map projection on the courtroom wall. The map showed that Elias's property line was entirely fictional, historical error caused by a transcription mistake in the 1920s. According to their expert, the land actually belonged to the county, meaning Elias had been illegally occupying public property for decades. The room grew heavy with the weight of the accusation. A murmur rippled through the spectators' gallery. Some people were shaking their heads in disgust, others looked at Elias with something akin to pity. The sheriff looked directly at Elias, a cruel, triumphant glint in his eyes. He didn't just want the land anymore, he wanted to see the man humbled, humiliated, and financially ruined. He wanted to force an eviction order that would involve bulldozers and police cruisers, a public spectacle that would serve as a warning to anyone else who dared stand in the way of his development plans. Elias sat still, listening to the expert drone on about coordinates, GIS layering, and historical inaccuracies. He saw the way the judge nodded along, completely captured by the narrative of technical authority. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. They were rewriting the past in real time, using the language of science to erase a lifetime of truth. But Elias noticed something in the presentation. The expert had skipped over the 1974 transition period, claiming that all records from that year were lost in a basement flood. It was a brilliant lie, but it was also a fatal one. It was the hubris of the sheriff. He thought that by claiming the records were lost, he had secured his immunity. He didn't anticipate that someone might have a personal connection to that specific year, or that someone might have been a young man helping his father, the county commissioner, organize those very files the day before the plane crash. Elias remembered that day vividly. His father, a man who believed that history was a sacred trust, had given him the document. "This protects us, Elias," he had whispered. "Not from the law, but from men who think they are above it." He had never told a soul, not even his own wife. He kept it hidden in the barn, wrapped in wax paper, protected from moisture and the prying eyes of the world. As the expert finished his presentation and the courtroom fell into a tense, expectant silence, the judge leaned forward. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said, his voice cold and devoid of sympathy. "The court has heard the evidence regarding the land's ownership. Do you have anything to say before I issue the summary judgment for the county?" The courtroom held its breath. The sheriff stood up slightly, ready to walk to the front, eager to take possession of the victory. He expected Elias to crumble, to plead for a stay of execution or to beg for more time. He expected weakness. Instead, Elias stood up slowly. He didn't look like a defeated man. His posture was straight, his eyes clear and focused. He reached into his worn, canvas jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. It was battered, stained, and smelled faintly of the earth he had worked his entire life. "I don't have a map," Elias said, his voice steady and echoing against the high ceiling of the courtroom. "And I don't have a team of surveyors. But I do have a memory of a man who believed in integrity, and I have the physical proof that this entire trial is built on a foundation of manufactured lies." The prosecutor scoffed, dismissing it as old, irrelevant paperwork. But as Elias handed the envelope to the bailiff, the air in the room seemed to shift. The sheriff's smug smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. He knew that envelope contained something, but he was certain there was nothing in existence that could override the modern evidence he had so carefully fabricated. The tension was palpable, you could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit as the judge slowly opened the folder and began to read. The game was no longer about the land. It was about the exposure of a rot that went deeper than anyone had dared to imagine. The silence that followed the judge opening the envelope was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a tectonic shift. The judge, a man who had spent 3 decades interpreting the cold, hard letter of the law, stopped reading. His eyes flickered back and forth across the page, and his complexion, which had been a healthy, ruddy pink, began to drain of color. He looked up from the document, then at the sheriff, and then back at the document. He didn't say a word, but the sudden shift in his demeanor, the way his posture stiffened and his jaw tightened, told everyone in the room that the narrative had just collapsed. Sheriff Vance sensed the change before anyone else. He stood up, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and panic. "Your Honor, I object. That document is a fabrication. It's a plant, an attempt to delay these proceedings with some kind of antique parlor trick." The prosecutor, sensing the disaster, jumped to his feet as well, but his voice lacked conviction. He was looking at the judge's face, and he saw what the sheriff refused to see: the judge was holding a death warrant for the sheriff's career. The document wasn't just a deed, it was an original, notarized, and sealed land use designation from the office of the state commissioner, dated exactly 2 days before the tragic plane crash that had supposedly destroyed all records. More importantly, it contained a detailed audit trail of the land's original transfer, including signatures that linked back to the sheriff's own grandfather, who had been a key figure in the town's land development board in the 1970s. It was the original sin of the county's growth, a document that proved the land had never been eligible for state seizure, and, more damningly, that the sheriff's ancestors had stolen the legal rights to the town's development through a series of illegal, backdated signatures. The document proved that the current sheriff's entire authority and his family's massive real estate empire were built upon a foundation of fraud that stretched back 50 years. It wasn't just about Elias's farm anymore. It was about every single land deal the sheriff's family had touched for half a century. "Sheriff," the judge said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it sounded like a thunderclap in the quiet room. "Sit down." "But Your Honor." "I said, sit down." The judge stood up, his robes swirling around him. He turned to the clerk. "Bailiff, please ensure the sheriff remains in his seat." District Attorney, approached the bench. The courtroom erupted into a low roar. The spectators were leaning over, trying to catch a glimpse of the paper that had just paralyzed the most powerful man in the county. Elias remained where he was, his hands clasped, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. He wasn't taking pleasure in the destruction, he was simply witnessing the restoration of order. He had kept his promise to his father. He had kept the legacy safe. The sheriff, stripped of his bravado, looked around the room. He saw his deputies, who had been laughing moments ago, now staring at the floor, their hands instinctively moving away from their sidearms. They were starting to realize that the man they had served, the man they had trusted, was a fraud. The spell was broken. The fear that had kept the town silent was evaporating, replaced by the sharp, electric shock of realization. The sheriff's phone began to buzz incessantly in his pocket, a flurry of messages from his conspirators, who were likely seeing the news of the courtroom proceedings being broadcast over local radio. The judge cleared his throat, his face a mask of stern, cold resolve. "This document is a certified, historical instrument of the state name. It contains evidence of systematic, long-term fraud involving multiple high-ranking officials. It appears that the records the court was presented with earlier today were not just inaccurate, they were willfully falsified. This trial is hereby recessed indefinitely. Sheriff Vance, you are instructed to remain in the county until the state attorney general arrives. And let the record show that the property in question, the Thorne estate, is now under the protection of the state pending a full federal investigation." As the judge exited the bench, the room descended into chaos. Reporters, who had been bored by the property dispute, were now rushing toward the front, cameras flashing. The sheriff, looking pale and suddenly very small, tried to push his way toward the exit, but the bailiffs, their allegiances shifting in real time, stood firm. They were no longer the sheriff's men, they were officers of the court, and the court had just turned on their master. Elias turned to leave, his task complete. He walked toward the back of the courtroom, passing the sheriff's desk. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The look of utter defeat on the sheriff's face was the only victory he needed. He stepped out of the courthouse and into the bright, blinding light of the afternoon, the weight of the last 2 years finally lifted from his shoulders, leaving behind a legacy that would now be defined by truth rather than greed. The aftermath in Miller's Creek was swifter and more devastating than anyone could have anticipated. Within 72 hours, the state's attorney general's office had descended upon the county courthouse. It wasn't just a simple review, it was a total extraction. The discovery of the document provided by Elias Thorne acted as a skeleton key, unlocking a web of corruption that reached far beyond the sheriff's office. It turned out that the modern land development project was part of a larger, multi-county money laundering scheme. When the federal investigators began auditing the records mentioned in Elias's document, they found that the sheriff's family hadn't just stolen land, they had been siphoning municipal funds into private offshore accounts for decades. The sheriff, once the untouchable titan of Miller's Creek, was arrested in his own home just 4 days after the trial. The footage of his arrest, a man who had spent his career bullying others being led away in cuffs by agents he had no power to intimidate, became the defining image of the scandal. It was the ultimate contrast. The man who had preached law and order had been the greatest violator of the law in the county's history. The community, once paralyzed by fear, experienced a profound, collective catharsis. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to each other in months began to gather in the town square, sharing stories of how they, too, had been intimidated or cheated by the sheriff's administration. Elias Thorne, meanwhile, retreated to his farm. He became a reluctant folk hero, though he shied away from the cameras and the interview requests from major networks. He didn't want fame, he wanted his life back. The federal government, in their settlement, officially cleared the title to the Thorne estate, designating it as a protected heritage site. The proposed highway was rerouted entirely, bypassing the valley to preserve the historical integrity of the land. It was a victory for the preservation of history over the relentless, unthinking march of progress. The final piece of the puzzle came when Elias opened the small, hidden compartment in his father's old desk, where he had kept the original, secondary copy of the land grant for insurance. He found a sealed letter addressed to him, written in his father's steady, precise hand. It read, "Elias, if you are reading this, it means the men of greed finally came for our home. Never mistake their power for strength. True strength is in the truth, and truth is a document that time cannot burn. Hold it tight, keep your head high, and never let them tell you who you are." Elias realized that his father had known, 50 years ago, that this day would come. The setup, the trial, and the inevitable downfall of the sheriff were all part of a cycle of corruption that had finally met its match. The farmer had won, not by fighting with the weapons of the corrupt, but by holding the one thing they could never replicate, the absolute, document-backed truth. Life on the farm returned to a rhythm that felt almost sacred. The soil seemed richer, the mornings quieter, and the encroaching shadow of the development project was gone. Elias spent his days working the fields, his hands still calloused, his spirit finally at peace. He had saved the land, but in the process, he had also saved the soul of his town. The story of Miller's Creek serves as a timeless reminder that even in the face of absolute, systemic abuse, there is no such thing as an invincible tyrant. All it takes is one person who refuses to move, one person who has the receipts, and one moment where the truth is finally laid on the table. The sheriff's career wasn't just ruined, it was erased, leaving behind a blank slate for the community to write a new, honest history. And as the sun sets over the Thorne farm, casting long shadows across the fields, it is clear that the land remains, just as it always was, stubborn, enduring, and ultimately, free. The final chapter of the sheriff's tyranny was not a dramatic explosion, but a quiet, firm correction, a testament to the fact that while some may try to own the land, they can never own the truth. The legacy of the Thornes would continue, undisturbed, for generations to come, standing as a silent, powerful warning to anyone who thinks they can build their future on the ruin of an honest man.